The mystery at the bottom of the river is a true spiritual horror story. I heard it told by a friend. The story through your words is as follows. My hometown is in the river region, where there are many small rivers and dense green trees, and this place also contains countless mysteries that neither humans nor science can explain. In the past, when my grandfather was still alive, he often told his children and grandchildren stories from the past, stories he had witnessed and also stories passed down from generation to generation. At that time, my grandmother was over 80 years old. But her mind is still very clear. My grandmother has loved her children and grandchildren all her life, so whether she is a grandchild or a grandchild, she loves her very much. Every afternoon and evening, she gathers at a common place, her house, to tell her stories about the past. At times like that, my grandmother is very happy, because my children and grandchildren love to listen to her stories. The stories below are what my grandmother told me, and are also a whole sky of memories whenever I remember her. In the 1950s, when the country was still wild, especially in the countryside, there was war everywhere. People lived in fear, afraid of bombs, afraid of enemies, and afraid of mysterious things around them in the countryside. In that distance, each house is often separated by acres of fields or wild trees. The roads only have small paths, or you have to take a boat. Right next to your grandmother's house is a large river, with coconut leaves on both sides. The water is overgrown and the river is so deep that I don't know how deep it is. I only know that people around there only dare to canoe during the day. Unless there is something very urgent, they risk going at night. About 100 meters from my grandmother's house is a river junction, where the water flows fast and the surrounding banks are the gloomiest. One evening, when all the people had turned off their lights and went to sleep, a cry for help rang out. Because the countryside was extremely quiet at night, the cry for help sounded very loud and echoed far away, startling everyone. I lit a fire to look, and saw a large fishing boat rolling in the water flowing in the middle of the intersection. The couple tried to hold on to the rowers to hold the boat, but the boat still slowly entered the vortex. Everyone panicked and quickly took the boat and rope and rowed out to the river. One end of the rope was tied to a tree on the shore and the other was held. When they were about 4 meters away from the canoe, they threw the rope to the canoe owner, but because the boat was unstable and the couple was holding the oars, it took several throws for the husband to get the rope. As soon as they grabbed the rope and jumped down, the canoe sank to the bottom of the river. They were pulled to shore, but had to sadly watch the family's only living asset sink to the bottom. The couple was given food and shelter by the people nearby. 2 days later, they said goodbye and returned to their hometown. A few months later, they suddenly returned, bringing with them some money from selling their land to find a machine to pull the boat up. In the past, the land in the past could only produce 1 crop per year, mainly growing rice to eat, not selling for much money, so they needed a boat to fish for shrimp, but at that time building a large fishing boat was not possible. It must be easy, so they decided to hire someone to lift the boat. When they hired a machine to pull the sinking boat, it was already noon. People brought large ropes and sharp chains to pull them. They didn't know how to find the exact location where the boat was lying and hook the ropes to it. They pulled for a long time until the sun disappeared. The canoe reached the river surface. They pulled it to shore, then anchored right at the beginning of the fork. The plan was to pull it up the next morning to repair it, but who would have thought that all the ropes tying the boat and everything would break that night. The boat sank back into the river, right where it had sunk before. Because it was dark the day before when they pulled it out, the tractor was still there to pull the boat ashore the next day. They decided to pull it out again. This time because it was pulled early in the morning, by noon the boat was already floating. Because the rope was pulled up close to the river, but in the morning people discovered that the boat had broken its rope and slipped into the river. They dived to look for it but could not find it. So, an old man there heard the story and told the boat owner and his wife to try going back to the intersection to find out later. The couple rented a boat to go back to the river intersection, and also hired a diver. When they reached the intersection, the diver jumped down to look for him. After a while, the diver emerged, his face pale and grey, speechless. They brought him to shore. The people there saw him and gave him hot water to drink. When he calmed down, he said, "Don't look for or pull the boat up anymore, you and your wife won't be able to get it, they already want it, so don't fight anymore. I've also given up diving, I never dare to dive down there. No more." But no matter who asked him what he saw down there, he didn't say anything, just shook his head in fear. And that's the end of your short story. The next story you tell is as follows. When the country was still in difficulty, everything was still rudimentary and undeveloped, all families in the countryside lived mainly on self-grown rice and potatoes, fish and shrimp caught from the fields in the river, and at night there were only oil lamps, wanting to go out. In addition to having to light torches, there is a house consisting of 4 people, the old man and his wife and their son and his wife. During the day, the old man and his son and his wife go to the fields to plant rice and potatoes, while the old woman stays at home to take care of the food. One day she suddenly fell ill, ate less and less. Her daughter-in-law had to give up her work in the fields to stay at home to cook and take care of her mother-in-law. Her daughter-in-law is a gentle and filial person. Every day she poured rice and water, but she still didn't get better. The bottle of herbal medicine was hot every day. That day, when she came back from the fields, she called the old man and said, "I'm getting sick more and more. No matter how much medicine I take, I can't see any relief. I'm cold and afraid of the wind coming in. Please build me a private house that's airtight, leaving only a small window to put food and water in." The old man listened, so he and his son built a small house next to the house for her. Inside there was only a bamboo bed, covered with film. When she came in, everything was closed, leaving only a small window to serve food. The water came in, and after everything, the old man and his son went to the fields to work normally. The wife stayed at home and still took medicine for her mother-in-law, but since the old woman came in, she has never seen her face again. Every time she brought in rice, she would say that little rice was not enough. The daughter-in-law thought that her mother-in-law had recovered from her illness, so she was very happy. Each time she brought more rice for her, but every day she brought more rice. She always criticized her for not being enough. One day she brought food, but she didn't hear her talk. She stood for a while and heard snoring coming from inside the membrane. She was curious if her mother-in-law was okay. What now? So she took a tree branch and lifted the curtain to take a look. When the curtain was lifted, oh my God, she couldn't believe her eyes anymore. The person lying there no longer looked like her mother-in-law, but was a terrible demon with messy white hair, hair growing all over his body, wrinkled face, sunken eyes, long black nails, constantly snoring on the bed. She panicked, threw down the tree branch and ran outside. In the afternoon, everyone came home from work. She pulled her husband out to whisper, but because he loved his mother, he didn't believe his wife. He thought his wife didn't want to take care of her mother, so he made up an excuse to lie. Well, his new wife told him to stay home and see if he could find out tomorrow. The next day, father and son still went to work in the fields, but at noon the son had a take a look. He was startled because just as his wife said, the person lying there was really no longer his mother. He ran to the field. Tell everything to your father. At first the old man didn't believe it, but because his son affirmed it, he also became suspicious. He quit his job and followed his son home, and opened the curtain again. When everyone knew the truth, they were extremely afraid. The old man decided to destroy her. He went to the window and whispered to her, "This house is not sturdy anymore. I'm afraid the strong wind will make you cold. Tomorrow I will rebuild the house to make it more sturdy." When she heard that, she said, "You can do it, but you have to cover me with leaves. I can't get out of the wind." The next morning, the old man and his son began to disassemble the house. Many leaves and trees they built and covered around her. When the hut was disassembled, the place covered with old leaves was already at noon. They took large torches and rushed into the pile of leaves where the old demon woman was lying. Because the leaves were dry at noon, the fire immediately burned very loudly. Roaring and screaming rang out. A moment later, when the whole family stood far away. The fire, she jumped into the fire. Her eyes were red as blood, her cheeks were sunken, her back was bent, her hairy arms and legs were full of anger. She looked at them, she screamed and then ran away into the distance. Ended. The whole family packed up their things and quickly got into the boat and left, not daring to stay there another day, for fear of her coming back to take revenge. And this is the end of the story. Thank you. You have shared 2 very good stories for the channel. Everyone who listens to the story finds it interesting. Please give me 1 like and 1 subscriber. I hope everyone has fun listening to the story. See you in the next videos. Goodbye.